There have been famous SLis in the past. SLi still known as Rambo, SLi and the Family Stone, but today is not about SLy, it's all about SLi, and it's going to be my first ever experience of running two Voodoo cards together using that technology. Here described by Scott Sellers, one-time Chief Technology Officer, CEO and a bunch of other things at 3DFX.
For a game like Quake, which is doing these multiple texture unit functions, when you compare Voodoo 1 Quake, or Quake-like effects and Quake-like fill rate, to a Voodoo2 SLi, we've increased performance by a factor of about 10. So we really think that this is going to continue to propel us as absolutely the #1 gaming platform out there.
So SLi's been around with us for quite a while, though more recognisable as the scalable link interface that NVIDIA used until recently. I think they've stopped doing it altogether now, but NVIDIA bought out 3DFX in 2000, so we know where they got that idea from. And on the Voodoo 2, it's actually called Scanline Interleave. So same kind of idea where you were provided with a ribbon cable to connect two cards together. And NVIDIA didn't stop there, because they had a card out in the 7 series, the 7950 GX2, which is effectively two cards built into a single slot. So you've got your kind of SLi built in out of the box, which is a pretty cool idea. But yeah, that wasn't their idea either, because back in the day there was this beast of a thing, the Quantum 3D Obsidian 2 X24. Yeah, the same idea. We've got two Voodoo 2s built into a single card, only taking up one slot, so you've got all your power there, not taking up too much room in your PC. So yeah, NVIDIA owe quite a lot to 3DFX for some of the innovations that they brought in the years to follow. So my adventures with the Voodoo 2 begin with this, which I got on eBay about a year and a half ago. So it's a Dragon 3000 from Gamewood, got it in its box, got it at a reasonable price as well. I think it was about £70 or something, which isn't bad these days for a boxed Voodoo 2. There wasn't much interest. Surprised, I was expecting a bidding war and thought I would have some competition, but I didn't. So really pleased to have this, and it's been sitting around on my shelf and I haven't really been sure what to do with it. I sort of messed about with it, but thought it was time to get a Voodoo 2 rig going. You know, people showed me their rigs back in the day, and I was running I think I was running a Banshee at the time, but yeah, so it's always been something I've kind of wanted to do, and all of a sudden I've got a chance to do just that. So a while back I was on the lookout for a second card to go with this, and I knew that there were issues with two different cards from different manufacturers, and that was just with reference designs. Now this Dragon isn't a reference design, so you can see we've got everything that we need here in the box, but this driver CD, which is good for the Dragon itself, is not going to be any use to us for two cards from different manufacturers, because 3DFX actually stopped that happening, as we can see in this little letter where somebody wrote to a computer magazine back in the day going, I bought two different Voodoo cards and they don't work. And there's a little quote from some dude at 3DFX who says, yes, that's deliberate so that we can support the cards better, we don't allow you to mix and match. Nowadays I have heard, and I knew that there were drivers that might allow us to get around that, which is why I took a chance, bought a second card, and we'll find out if it works shortly. And this is the other card. So I got this on eBay just a few months ago, whereas I bought the Dragon 3000 about a year and a half ago, I think. This was pretty cheap. I can't remember exactly what it was, £45 or something like that. The reason being that the guys said that there were artifacts on the screen and the picture wasn't clear, and I thought, there's a lot of cables going on with these things and there's a good chance that it's something trivial, so I went for it. Nobody else bid for it, and it works fine, so that was good. And just in case it didn't, I was actually just kind of keeping half an eye on eBay, and you can still get them for reasonable money. There was a Diamond Monster 3D2, which the bid on that just ended yesterday, I think, and it went for £50, which I think is a pretty good price for a Voodoo 2, so they can be bought for cheap. Getting them in a pair might be a bit problematic these days though. So yeah, this is a totally reference design card. It's a very familiar layout. There's nothing unusual about it. The specs on both of these cards, despite the Dragon being a bit different, is the same. So you've got your 90 megahertz processor speed and memory speed. Both of them have 12 megabytes and just the usual stuff, 192-bit memory bus, DirectX 6, all the rest of it. So I'm hoping that this might be of use if anybody wants to mismatch cards and get them working in SLi. And because these are different and not both reference designs, I think it's a bit more tricky. I think if you've got two from different manufacturers with reference designs, you're probably going to be okay. With these, I had to try a bunch of different motherboards, a bunch of different machines. I had to swap the cards around different PCI slots. I had to even change the order of the cards. So some machines it worked in, some machines it wouldn't work at all. So it wouldn't recognize it as being in SLi mode. So this machine is my slot A machine. I'm pleased to get it out because it doesn't get much use. It's got a Gigabyte GA71XE motherboard. At the minute, it's only got 384 megs of RAM in because I was short on sticks, so I've only had available 328 megabyte sticks of PC100. It's got a Sound Blaster Live in there, so I think it's a reasonable machine. I know that the Voodoo2 scales well into faster processor territory, so you're probably not going to get the most out of it here. You probably want to be heading towards the gigahertz mark for that, but the 600, it's probably a reasonably period correct sort of CPU to be doing this with, so that's what we're going to go with. This machine's probably going to be a keeper, so I'll probably upgrade the processor at some point, but I want a decent 2D and direct 3D card to go with these Voodoos, and I'm going to use my WinFast GeForce 2 Ti for that, so should be a nice pairing, cover all the bases. So I know from my aforementioned previous tedious experimentation that the Eontronics card has to go in first. Didn't seem to like it when the Dragon went in front of it, so we'll do that. So we'll pop the Dragon in next to that. All of the machines I experimented with didn't seem to like having a Voodoo directly in the PCI slot next to the 2D card, so I'm not sure if that's just me or something that you need to watch out for. So now, having hooked up all the cables on the other side, it's time for the SLi bridge, and you can get these rather funky solid ones on eBay in all sorts of different colours, purple, yellow, whatever you want, as opposed to the perhaps more fragile ribbon kind. These are also, I think you can put them on either way, whereas the ribbon type is directional and it has a twist in, I think. Not having used one, but from what I gather. So yep, this is a nice little thing. It looks pretty cool. Shame there's no window in the case to admire it once the lid is shut. So how to test. Got a broad range of stuff. Took Scott Seller's advice. Not quite. We're not going to do Quake. We're going to do Quake 2 to give us some OpenGL benchmarks. We're going to do Unreal Tournament to give us our native glide benchmarks. We're going to do 3D Mark 99 to give us some direct 3D benchmarks. And we're going to compare the two Voodoos against a couple of other 3DFX cards from the Voodoo 3 range and a Banshee as well. So we're also going to do Expendable, which is also native glide, but I think it only uses single textures, so might give the Banshee a bit of a chance, but we'll see how that goes. Just out of curiosity, before I started the benchmarking, I wondered if these cards were the same, if there were any one better than the other. So I ran them. On paper, they were the same. I couldn't see why the Gainwood one went to so much effort to change away from the reference design. There was no overclocking, no nothing done. They put the heat sinks on, they changed the design of the board, but they didn't improve the card in any way. I don't know whether there was anything about it that maybe allows it to be overclocked higher. It's got the heat sinks on, but you could retrofit those to the other cards as well. There were even some cards I think came out, I think it was the Canopus one, had a fan on it anyway. So yeah, I'm not really sure, but the performance as I ran these graphs, they were identical in almost every scenario. Okay, we'll get into some benchmarking in a minute, but we'll first have a quick mention about the drivers that we're using here. So if you're using mismatched Voodoo2 cards, you don't have a lot of choice. There are some drivers called Fast Voodoo2, which I think were developed by the people who run a website called 3dfxzone.it, so it's an Italian site. They're available on the Vogon's drivers website as well, which is where I got them from. There are a few different versions of them, and I think also from when I was trying to figure out how to do this, there are some of the 3DFX DLLs that get installed in the driver pack that you can edit with a hex editor, and you can make things happen that way if you want to have a bit more experimentation on your own. But after a bit of toing and froing, I landed on these Fast Voodoo 2 version 4.6, which I think is the last version that was developed, and with a bit of faffing about, managed to get it to work. I suspect things will be much easier if you've got two different manufacturers, but they use the reference design. But I think if you get anything that's got a bit of a crazy design like the Dragon 3000, it's going to take a bit more work, but hopefully if you've got enough machines to try it on, and enough motherboards and enough patience, you should get it working just by a bit of trial and error. So we're going to start with 3D Mark 99, and for this, as I said earlier, we're going to use some other cards to compare it with. So I ran all the benchmarks with the Voodoo2s in SLi, and then I also ran them for a Voodoo Banshee, and I also ran them for a Voodoo 2000, and then finished off with a Voodoo 3000. So there was a bunch of people who said that they would expect the Voodoo2s in SLi to fall between the Voodoo 2000 and the Voodoo 3000. From what I read online, that isn't the way it would normally happen. Normally the Voodoo 2000 would beat a pair of SLi Voodoo2s, except in certain circumstances. So we'll find out in just a second. So the single Voodoo experiment I did before was run in 800 by 600, which was the maximum resolution of a single card. With them in SLi, you can go up to 1024 by 768, so we've got two scores of each card. So for the SLi configuration, we've got 800 by 600 coming in at 3,794, and for the 1024 by 768 we've got 3,407. So I've seen higher scores than this, but I've seen comparable scores. May have something to do with the CPU scaling, so I've seen scores up to about 5,000 in 3D Mark 99, but possibly using a much faster processor, and you do see a difference in frame rate, which I gathered when reading the excellent Voodoo2 scaling project that Phil's Computer Labs did a while back. Got some slightly weird results for the Banshee. The Banshee resoundingly thrashed the Voodoo2s in SLi at 800 by 600, getting a score of 3963, and I rerun that a couple of times, and indeed that's what it came back with. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. It fell behind a little bit when we got to 1024 by 768, only getting a score of 2800. The Voodoo 2000 got a score at 800 by 600 of 5003, and then at 1024 by 768 3900, so that does fairly comfortably beat the Voodoo2s in SLi. And then, as you'd expect, the Voodoo 3000 got 5275, 4312, so that was the king of the hill, slightly faster than the Voodoo 2000. In Quake 2, the Voodoo2s in SLi got 84.2 at 800 by 600 and 68.1 frames a second at 1024 by 768, resoundingly thrashing the Banshee, as you'd expect, because we're into multi-texture territory here. The Banshee only got 45.7 and 28.5 respectively. The Voodoo 2000 was up ahead with 106.4 for 800 by 600 and 71.8 for 1024 by 768. And then again, just a bit faster, but not massively faster, the Voodoo 3000 got 115.3 frames a second at 800 by 600 and 83.9 at 1024 by 768. So kind of what you'd expect. You can really see where that single TMU hurts the Banshee when you come into games like this. So, onto Unreal Tournament, and the two Voodoo2s started off at 800 by 600 with 51.4 frames a second, and then we got 53.8 frames a second at 1024 by 768, so faster at the higher resolution. I did check that as well and got the same results, so not quite sure what was going on there, but perhaps it was just got to the point where you were only using the resources on one card and then moved on to the other when the higher resolution kicked in. They resoundingly beat the Banshee. Unsurprisingly, the Banshee got 43 frames a second at 800 by 600 and could only manage 27 frames a second at 1024 by 768. It gets quite interesting with the Voodoo 2000, which got 55.7 at 800 by 600 and 50 at 1024 by 768. So the two Voodoo2s were slower at 800 by 600 than the Voodoo 2000, but faster at 1024 by 768, so not quite sure why that might be. For the Voodoo 3000, again, at 800 by 600 it got 58 frames a second, and at 1024 by 768 it got just over 52 frames a second. So the two Voodoo2s were slower at 800 by 600, but faster than the Voodoo 3 3000 at 1024 by 768. So not quite sure why that would be, but those were the results I got. So what can I say? Pretty good performance from the two Voodoos in SLi. So finally we're on to Expendable, and this is interesting results as well. So the two Voodoos in SLi got at 800 by 600 49 frames a second, and at 1024 by 768 they got 45.6. So the Banshee came in at 59.5 at 800 by 600 and 46.5 at 1024 by 768, so it beat the SLi Voodoos in both cases. Now I'm guessing that's because this isn't a multi-textured game, and then you start to see the benefits of the higher clocks and the more memory on the Banshee. And yeah, it beat out the two Voodoos in SLi on Expendable. When we got into the Voodoo 3 2000, it's a different story. So 55.7 at 800 by 600 and 50 at 1024 by 768. So again, as you'd expect, the Voodoo 3 2000 slightly faster than the two Voodoo 2s in SLi. And then finally with the Voodoo 3 3000, it's the winner with 58 at 800 by 600 and 52.3 at 1024 by 768. So more or less what you'd expect, with a few quirky results. The Voodoos winning in an Unreal tournament in certain circumstances, and a very, very good performance by the Banshee in Expendable as compared to the two Voodoo 2s in SLi. So it was a fun little experiment, but all I really wanted to see was that the two Voodoo 2s are working properly. But it also raised the question of, if you were to buy some Voodoo 2s for doing some SLi gaming in 2024, is it really worth it? I guess it's only if you really want to have two Voodoo 2s. Everybody says that you should get a Voodoo 3, you get better performance, you only use one slot. But there's a kind of magic about having the two cards working together. I would say if I could do it again, I would try and get two cards of reference design. The Dragon 3000 was the first one I bought because I thought it looked cool, but when it comes to matching another card with it, I think those Dragon 3000s are quite pricey now when they appear. So I would try and get two reference cards, and then I suspect, though I can't prove it, you'd probably have a much easier time with the fast Voodoo 2 drivers and getting them to work happily together. But for anybody who's got a Dragon 3000 or similar kicking around, I think you've got a fighting chance of getting it going, as long as you've got a few motherboards to try and that kind of thing. So I would say if you want to try this, the cheapest way to do it's going to be to buy two different cards, probably two different reference cards, and that's the way I would go if I was to do it again, as cool as the Dragon 3000 is. So that pretty much wraps it up. It was a fun little experiment. Like I said, I've never done it before. I've got two cards at work, which I'm pleased with, in a machine and a motherboard that it works in. I'm not going to touch it because who knows if I'd mess it up and get it working again. But I think that slot A machine is a great base, and if I can get a faster processor, I think they went up to 1 gigahertz in the slot A. Probably quite expensive to get one now, but if I can get a few 100 megahertz faster processor and get the memory up to 512 megabytes, I think I'd be fairly pleased with that as my Voodoo 2 rig. So that was the lesson I learnt in this little experiment, and I enjoyed having the two cards because I think it's a kind of magical thing. SLi, even to this day, I did it with some later GeForce cards and just like looking at it and like knowing they're there. So it was a bit of fun, and if you like the idea of it, I would say go for it. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it as entertaining as I found it painful getting these things working, and I hope you'll join me for the next video. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.